Well, this is our last session, and I thought I might at least begin by discussing how the material of this course fits into the larger overall project of philosophy and indeed into contemporary intellectual life. It seems to me, now I am not, I don't suppose I represent a majority opinion here, but at any rate, this is the conception I have of contemporary philosophy. There's a single overriding question in contemporary philosophy, and it essentially derives from the fact that the central intellectual fact about the current era is that we know an awful lot more than our ancestors did. The central intellectual fact is that knowledge grows. We just know a whole lot more. I won't say each year, but each decade. I was involved in the President's Decade of the Brain in the 90s when we were given a lot of government money to spend on brain research. And the result of that was that there was an explosion in brain research, and we now know a whole lot more about brain functioning, and we will continue to know more. Now, we still don't know the crucial answers to the crucial questions, such as how exactly do brain processes cause consciousness, and how does our consciousness affect our behavior. We're still, we got a long way to go with those. But there is, as a result of this, there's a single overriding question in contemporary philosophy, and that is, now that we have a pretty fair conception about how the world works, about how the universe works, we would like to know, how does our self-conception fit into that? How does our conception of ourselves fit into what we know about how the world works from physics, chemistry, and the other hard sciences? Now, the basic message of the physical sciences is that the universe consists entirely in very small entities that we, for convenience, call particles. That's almost certainly the wrong word. They're more likely thought of as points of mass, energy, or strength, or strings. But in any case, for contemporary purposes, we'll call them particles. So the universe consists entirely in particles. These are in fields of force, and the particles are organized into systems. Now, there are just a hell of a lot of systems. The universe is a lot bigger than we used to think, and there are lots more galaxies. I discovered to my horror the other day in the New York Times that we now think there are 3 times as many galaxies and stars in the universe as we used to think. I don't know why this depressed me, but I guess it's sort of, oh my gosh, it's more to explore than I thought. But in any case, we live in a very big universe. We're a tiny little planet in a rather suburban solar system. And I guess we have to assume that there are other planets like ours with some kind of life forms, but we don't know that for a fact, and we may never know the answer to that. But in any case, here we are on our little planet in a universe consisting entirely of particles in fields of force, and these particles are typically organized into systems, where the boundaries of a system are set by causal relations. So a water molecule is a system, a baby is a system, a solar system is a system, and a galaxy is a system. So you've got all these systems in a hell of a big universe, and then all the rest is just kind of empty space. Lucretius saw this. He described it as atoms in the void. Now, on this little Earth, an interesting local phenomenon happened, and that is some big molecules with carbon base, but lots of hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, started to evolve. And here's a scandal. We don't know how life began, but we did know that at some point it did begin. At one time there was no life on this Earth, and since then, for the past 3 to 5 billion years, there has been life. And once there was life, another central fact emerged, and that is life forms evolve by methods that were roughly described by Darwin. He didn't understand the facts about DNA and mutation. But in any case, there is a Darwinian or Wallace-Darwin conception of evolution that we have to tack onto our conception that we get from physics and chemistry. So the two basic facts are the facts of atomic physics and the facts of evolutionary biology. And these are the facts that the world consists entirely of very small entities organized into systems, and some of those carbon-based systems have evolved over a period of several million or billion years into us. And now here is our problem. We have a certain self-conception of ourselves as being conscious, mindful, rational, intentionalistic, ethical, moral. We think we have free will. We're certain that we're capable of using language. We organize ourselves into societies. Now, how do we reconcile that picture of ourselves as free, conscious, rational agents into a universe consisting entirely of mindless, meaningless physical particles? Now, in a way, that's been the dominant question for some centuries, but it has emerged, I think, in a particularly stark form in the past few decades. So this course is concerned with a central aspect. I won't say the only aspect of that by any means, but it is a central aspect, and that is, how is it possible that there can be language using rational agents in a world of the sort that I described? And the question for me, the central question in the philosophy of language, is how do we get from the physics to the semantics? How do we get from the sounds that come out of my mouth, which are, after all, rather trivial physical phenomena, how do we get from those to speech acts, to questions, assertions, descriptions, promises, and all the rest of it? How do we get from the sheer acoustic blast, the sound which is intrinsically without meaning, there's no intrinsic meaning to the sound, how do we get to speech acts? And I proposed an answer to that. But my answer makes it the case that the philosophy of language is really a branch of the philosophy of mind. It has to do with how mental phenomena are able to impose meaning on entities that are intrinsically meaningless, sounds and marks. Okay, however, I think that's a fascinating way to do the subject, and I've been doing it that way for, well, a long time, like the past 60 years. That's not the way that most philosophers want to do it nowadays. So let me now situate the philosophy of language within the more recent history. Now, beginning in the middle of the 17th century, Descartes, and he wasn't alone in this, there were others like Bacon, Descartes altered the subject by making epistemology, the problem of knowledge, the center of the subject. And Descartes, in a way, was confronted with the same question I am confronted with. He was confronted with the question, how do we reconcile the human reality with the physical reality? His answer was a disaster, and we're still living with the disaster. His answer was, well, there are two different universes. There's a physical universe described by physics and chemistry, and it's all mathematically determinate. But there is also a mental universe of conscious souls, and these conscious souls are not physical entities. Now then there becomes a crucial problem for him. How do the conscious souls relate to the physical bodies? And he never got an answer to that he was satisfied with, and incidentally, neither did anybody else. So I have an answer to that question. If you want to look at it, the simplest version is in a little book I wrote called Mind. Mind, a brief introduction, but there are other things I've written about it. Okay, now Descartes then, with epistemology as his central question, how is knowledge possible, tried to overcome skepticism. The problem of skepticism was absolutely central to 17th century philosophy, and really up till the 20th century it was the center of philosophy. The problem was, given that we apparently have all of this scientific knowledge, what's its foundation? How can we be sure of it? How can we be sure that it's not all a hallucination, that we're being systematically deceived? Because, according to Descartes, all we can actually know directly, all we can actually have direct awareness of, is the contents of our own mind. Now this is another great disaster in the history of philosophy, is that Descartes, along with all the other great thinkers of the era, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, etc., thought that you can't actually perceive directly objects and states of affairs in the world. So if I hold up an object and look at it on this picture, I don't actually see the object. What I see is an experience that's going on in my head. And that view is still common among scientists. I reviewed a book by Francis Crick, who was a pretty smart guy, and he held exactly that view, that we don't actually see objects in the world. We see our own experiences of those objects. And then Descartes and all these other guys had this problem. How do you get from the knowledge of our own experiences, which are private, subjective, and mental, how do you get from knowledge of them to knowledge of the physical world, which is public, objective, and physical? How do you get outside the circle of your own experiences? And if this were a course in epistemology, I would go through all of the disastrous efforts to answer that. The correct answer is to reject the initial move that says you never see objects and states of affairs in the world, that you only see your own experiences. Now, oddly enough, I think the correct view, the common sense view, is sometimes called realism, or in my version, it's called naive realism, because it says that you, in a normal case, you just see that damn piece of chalk or the thermos. Naive realism says that where perception is concerned, it looks like this. The guy here sees the object, and this is his visual experience. That's the object, and here's the guy. The reason I make it an arrow is, of course, it's got intentionality. The actual experience is going on inside his head, but it reaches up to the object. Now, here's an odd thing. I think that's absolutely right. No great philosopher of the past, assuming great philosophers, let's leave out the ancients. I don't know enough about them to have an intelligent opinion, but starting with Descartes, none of the great philosophers from Descartes, let's say, through Hegel, were naive realists. Well, too bad. Naive realism is right. What they thought was that they could disprove naive realism through things like hallucinations. In the case of a hallucination, you don't see the object. What do you see? Well, they said you see something. You see your own experience or something like that. But since it looks exactly the same as when you're actually seeing the object, then you should say that you don't see the object in this case any more than you do in the hallucination case. In the hallucination case, what you see is your own experience, and that acquired a name that's called a sense datum. What you see is your own sense data, and then the question is, what's the relationship between the sense data you do see and the objects that you don't see? And the answers to that were, without exception, bad answers. Locke and Descartes said, well, things you do see, your own experiences, are kind of a picture of the real world, and so you can figure out the real world by looking at the pictures. But then the question arises, how do you get from the knowledge of the sense data, which you can see, to the real object, which you can't see? And that view that says, well, you don't see objects really, but you see your own experiences, you see your sense data, and then they represent objects. They're like pictures of objects. That's called representative realism, or sometimes just the representative theory of perception. So on Descartes and Locke, this thing here is a picture of this thing here. It resembles it. You have resemblance, and that's because this thing here causes the sense datum. You have causation. Now, this picture, believe it or not, was very influential for a long time, and it still is. A lot of people in the sciences think, they're philosophically innocent, but they think, well, you don't see real objects, but you do see something going on in your head, which is kind of a picture of an object. I don't know if the high school teachers you had were as bad as the ones I had, but that was the version that we got in physics at the time, that you can't see the real world, but you do see resemblances. You do see entities that resemble the real world. Now, Berkeley, the guy that this town was named after, incidentally, very few towns are named after philosophers, only 2 in the United States that I know of. St. Augustine, Florida, they mispronounce it, but anyway, it doesn't matter. And Berkeley, we mispronounce it too, Berkeley, California. Berkeley looked at this picture and he said, this doesn't make any sense, because you can't say this thing that you do see resembles this thing that's invisible. If it's invisible, it doesn't look like anything. You can't say the sense datum you do see resembles the object you don't see. So instead of going back to naive realism, you hold your breath when you're reading Berkeley. You think he'll go back to naive realism. He doesn't. What he does is he just wipes out all of that and says, really, the universe consists entirely of minds and ideas. And that's a view that's called variously idealism or phenomenalism. And it's amazing that no great philosophers have been naive realists, but even more amazing is how many famous philosophers have been in various versions, idealists, or phenomenalists, and this persisted into the 20th century. Okay, now, so there are 2 legacies we had from Descartes that lasted until the mid-20th century, and they are, first, dualism, the idea that the universe divides into 2 flavors, the mental and the physical. And that, I think, is still with us. There aren't many professional philosophers who are old-time dualists, but I think an awful lot of ordinary people are dualists. And, of course, it fits in with most religions. You've got a body and a soul. Some of my students have even told me they have a body and a mind and a soul. Now, how the hell they need 3, I don't know. But anyway, they've got 3. I think that is all a mistake, and if this, of course, philosophy of mind, I'd tell you in great detail why it's a mistake. And the other problem that Descartes left us with was, how can you ever know anything? How can you ever get outside your own experiences? Now, in the mid-20th century, an awful lot of very good philosophers, and some of whom you've been reading, got the idea that the way to solve philosophical problems is by the study of language. And there was a period of several decades where the philosophy of language was regarded as the center of philosophy. Other problems were taken to depend on solutions in the philosophy of language. And specifically, a lot of other problems were supposed to arise from a failure to understand how language works. For example, a lot of people thought, well, all this problem about skepticism, how do you really know that you're seeing the thermos and not having a hallucination? To solve that problem, what you have to do is look at how we use words like no. And if you examine the ordinary use, it's an ordinary word. If you examine the ordinary use of the word no, you will see, of course, we can know that there's a thermos there. This is the kind of situation that counts as knowing that there's a thermos there. So I know, for example, a lot of people thought you could solve the problem of free will by looking at the ordinary use of words like free and of your own free will and voluntarily. And if somebody says, well, can you raise your arm of your own free will? Watch, I just did. So they thought analyzing the ordinary use of words would enable us to solve philosophical problems. And the most important of these guys was Wittgenstein, though Austin was also a part of this movement. By the way, I often read how much Austin was influenced by Wittgenstein. Nothing could be further from the truth. I knew Austin very well, and he had no sympathy for Wittgenstein at all. Wittgenstein was he would shake his head sadly and say, it's just loose. He did not think Wittgenstein was a careful thinker. He thought he was a bit Germanic, and as indeed he was, that a lot of it was obscure. But in any case, both Austin and Wittgenstein shared the assumption that an awful lot of philosophical problems, and Wittgenstein sometimes talks as if all philosophical problems, not Austin didn't think that, but an awful lot of philosophical problems could be solved by paying very close attention to the use of language. If we just studied language carefully, we would see that we could solve problems about the nature of human action, the nature of free will, the nature of knowledge, and all the rest of it. And you can read both Wittgenstein and Austin to see how they tried to do this. Now, it's fair to say that that project did not succeed. I won't say flatly that it failed, because it succeeded in some important areas, but it failed for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons it failed is that you need to distinguish between the circumstances in which we would say something and the circumstances in which it would be actually true that such and such was the case. Because we know from the theory of speech acts that there are lots of constraints on saying things besides just truth. You have to have evidence of a certain kind, and as Grice points out in his maxims, it has to be relevant to the conversation in various ways. Okay, now another very important development happened, and you're all familiar with it, and that is beginning in the late 19th century, the subject of logic was reinvented by Gottlob Frege. Now, I make it sound as if everybody knew that, but they didn't really. Frege's work was not translated into English in any large quantities until the 1950s. Now, there were other things that were translated. Sinn und Bedeutung was translated much earlier, but Frege's work only became widely known in the past half century, but among the pros, among people like Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein, they knew about Frege and they knew how important the work was. And then a lot of people thought, as part of the same movement, that said, well, the essential tool of the philosopher is the study of language. They thought the essential tool in the study of language is Frege's logic. Is mathematical logic, and in particular the predicate calculus, the first order quantificational calculus. And as I've told you before, that's the logic that is taught in everywhere in the United States, in textbooks all over the United States. The contemporary logic is essentially Frege's logic. And the idea was, if we apply these two tools, the mathematical logic as the tool and language as the subject matter, we would have the means for solving philosophical problems. Now, it isn't so much that that project failed, because it would be hard to say exactly how it failed. I told you a little bit about how it failed, but it turns out there are an awful lot of problems, like the nature of scientific knowledge, or for that matter, the nature of mental states, that can't just be solved by examining the ordinary use of language. And so the effect of that has been that the philosophy of language has become much more specialized, a much more technical discipline. And this is why I think I'm out of sympathy with a lot of contemporary philosophy of language. Though I think the central question in the philosophy of language is the question, how does language relate to reality? And that's a question about how human beings intentionally relate it to reality in the performance of speech acts, which are a form of intentional behavior. That seems to me the central question. But there is in philosophy, as in other disciplines, where there's a kind of Gresham's law whereby the more technical drives out the less technical. And a lot of people have thought, well, the right way to go is to use more elaborate formal systems. You see that. A classic example of that is Tarski's set theoretical analysis of truth. Another example that I haven't said much about, but which is very influential in contemporary philosophy, is to use the notion of possible worlds to solve philosophical problems in the philosophy of language. Now, the idea is this. We live in this world, but there are lots of other possible worlds. People differ in how much reality they want to attach to these possible worlds. David Lewis, who was sort of the champion of this, thought, well, there really are these other possible worlds. It's just they're not in the same space and time we're in. I think he was unusual in thinking that. Most people think, well, the idea of a possible world is just a way things might have been. But they want to analyze a whole lot of linguistic notions in terms of possible worlds. And one of their favorite, one of the things they think is a success story, I don't think that, I think it's a failure, is to analyze things like assertion and proposition, and above all, counterfactuals and modals in terms of possible worlds. So the idea is this. I happen to be wearing a blue shirt, but if I had chosen the shirt next to it to put on, I would have been wearing a red shirt. Now it's easy to see what fact makes it the case that I'm wearing a blue shirt. What facts make it the case that if I had chosen, I would have worn a red shirt? Now the answer that they propose to that is, well, there's a possible world in which you actually are wearing a red shirt, and then there's a whole lot of apparatus designed to say, well, what are the restrictions on the possible world that gives us really an analysis of the proposition that if you had chosen, you would have worn a red shirt. But related to this is the idea, well, what is a proposition really? And to my total amazement, these guys say, well, a proposition really is just a set of possible worlds. It's a set of possible worlds in which it's true. So there is a set of possible worlds in which I am wearing a blue shirt, and that is, we live in one of those possible worlds, but that's what a proposition is. It's a set of possible worlds. Some people say, well, it's a function from possible worlds to truth values, but they think that's just an alternative way of speaking. Now, I have serious problems with this. One immediate absurdity is this: if a proposition is a set of possible worlds, then every necessary proposition will be the same, because every necessary proposition is true in all possible worlds. And every impossible proposition, every necessarily false proposition will be the same, because the necessarily false proposition is false in all possible worlds. I thought that was just an obvious refutation of possible world semantics, so I thought they weren't going to go anywhere, and they have various things they say about this. In Al Martinich's book, there's an article by Stalnaker called Assertion, where he does to some extent face up to this problem. In any case, I think this is a mistaken route to go. I think we only understand the notion of a possible world in terms of notions like counterfactuals, how things might have been. So the analysis is circular. You don't really get an understanding of counterfactuals or modality by appealing to possible worlds, because you can only understand the possible worlds if you already understand the modality or the notion of counterfactuals. And in fact, many of the analyses I think are just plain false. But I haven't attacked this stuff in public, but maybe I should. But in any case, this is typical of the technical developments in the philosophy of language that have made it more into what Tom Kuhn would call normal science. There is a sort of way of proceeding, and you make contributions to the Lewis Stalnaker analysis of counterfactuals, and you discuss various ways of dealing with this problem or that problem. And so you get ever more technical discussions, I think all of which are based on a false assumption. And I guess I should probably publish more stuff criticizing this. I publish a lot of stuff criticizing the philosophy of mind, and it has some effect. I mean, it takes a long time, longer than you would think. But when I first started criticizing artificial intelligence, everybody said it was the craziest idea they ever heard. In the past few months, I've had 2 invitations to address international conferences on artificial intelligence, where the guy sending me the invitation says, well, we now agree with you that published an article called A Chinese Room. There's no reason why you should worry about it. But in any case, they now agree with the Chinese Room. Well, thanks a lot. That was 30 years ago that I published it. But in any case, you do have an effect, but it takes a long time, and you have to engage in a lot of battles in the meantime. Okay, now what I'm saying is this. I think that the philosophy of language as it is standardly pursued, I mean, if you look at recent textbooks in the philosophy of language, to me it's become a rather boring subject. It's a scholastic subject where you try to solve various technical problems. The fascinating problem in the philosophy of language is how does it relate to the rest, how does language relate to the rest of our life? And there are two directions of that relation. One is to see language as a development of pre-linguistic, biologically more basic forms of intentionality, and that's the thesis I advance in that article, What is Language? That's, so to speak, the top-down approach, where you go from language to its basis in the mind, and then there's the bottom-up approach, where you see language as providing the structure of human civilization, because the things we think are distinctive of human civilization, the institutions like money, property, government, marriage, universities, summer vacations, final exams, cocktail parties, and all that kind of stuff, all of those are linguistically created. The reason that my dog does not worry about his obligations to pay his taxes, or what he should do about the shift in power in Washington, is that he does not have the linguistic resources to cope with such problems. All of those phenomena are created by language, and that seems to me another set of problems. Now, when I say that language is based on more biologically fundamental properties of the mind, that might give you the impression that I'm advancing a sort of naive conception, which a lot of people hold, that really what we do with language is give expression to thoughts that we can have without language. And that's not true. Most of the thoughts that human beings can have, the thought, for example, that Barack Obama is going to have to try to recover his political ground in the next 2 years, that's not a thought that you can have without language. There are some thoughts you can have without language. I'm hungry, or it's too hot, or I'm getting wet from the rain. Those are thoughts you can have without language. But language doesn't just give expression to pre-linguistic thoughts, but it makes possible all kinds of thoughts that would not be possible without language. Partly that's because it creates a reality that can't exist without language, and that's the reality of money, property, government, marriage, and all the rest of it, but also because language allows us for all kinds of permutations and distinctions that you cannot make in pre-linguistic thought. You can't make the distinction, I don't see how you could in pre-linguistic thought, between a scope of operators. So if you have, I gave you an example of this, clumsily the guy stepped on the snail is distinct from the guy stepped clumsily on the snail. The first says it was clumsy of him to do it at all, and the second says he did it in a clumsy fashion. Now that's a neat possibility that language gives you, and of course what I gave you is just one example among literally an infinite number of these scope ambiguities. And that's the kind of thing you can't do without syntax. Syntax is an enormously powerful tool, and there's nothing really in pre-linguistic thought like the syntax of actual human languages. You can sort of shuffle images around a bit and shuffle entities of your intentional state, but nothing like the infinite generative capacity of language. And as I said, there are these two remarkable capacities of language: compositionality, where you can figure out what the sentence means by just knowing the meaning of the parts, and generativity, whereby you can produce, strictly speaking, an infinite number of new sentences. So I think language remains a fascinating subject, but I'm out of sympathy with the way that the subject matter of the philosophy of language has gone. And I didn't spend a lot of time attacking mainstream philosophy of language, but I want you to see in this last presentation where we're getting ready to take the final exam, how the material that we've been studying fits in to the overall philosophical enterprise and fits into the history of philosophy. The optimism that Russell and Austin and Wittgenstein had about solving all or most philosophical problems by the study of language, I think that optimism has abated, and it's probably a good thing that it has. There was an exaggerated sense of the importance of language. An awful lot of people thought, well, that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is the study of language, a certain kind of study of language, and that's too much. Language is central to the study of philosophy, but it's not the entire subject matter. But now once we get a more rational conception of language of the kind that I have been advocating, then it seems to me the subject can become more interesting. We can see both how it's based on pre-linguistic mental capacities, how it expands those capacities enormously, and how it enables us to create a reality which is the distinctively human reality, the reality of human institutions. Now you might say, well, what happened to skepticism? That was supposed to be the big deal problem up until the middle of the 20th century. Well, Austin and Wittgenstein, in their various ways, did try to make attacks on skepticism to show that it rested on a misunderstanding of language. And Wittgenstein had this notion of a language game. If you look at the language game that we actually play with notions like evidence, truth, knowledge, verification, you'll see that the skeptic is misconstruing the nature of language. Austin did the same sort of thing, though in a more careful and precise fashion. In an article he wrote called Other Minds, he talks about how we have knowledge of other people's minds, and then he uses that for a discussion of knowledge. Generally, he tried to show how this would solve the problem of skepticism. However, I think that the big argument against skepticism is one you never hear anybody make. I think the reason that skepticism no longer has the appeal that it once had is just that we know too much. You can't send people to the moon and bring them back and then wonder, does the external world exist? Is there really an external world? Is there a world independent of our experiences? It's just the sheer amount of information that we have makes it so that we can't take skepticism seriously as a live problem. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a room in philosophy for skeptical epistemology, but the skeptical problem is about like the traditional puzzles. It's about like Zeno's paradoxes. I remember Zeno, in order to walk to that wall, I'd have to walk first halfway. But in order to walk halfway, I'd have to walk half of that half. And in order to get that far, I'd have to do half of that. You remember how it goes? So it turns out, gosh, I can never get to the wall. I can't do it. Now that's a nice puzzle, and it's a good way to start freshmen off, getting them to see the solution to that puzzle. But nobody thinks, oh my gosh, we can't walk to the wall. And similarly, I want to say there are puzzles about knowledge. How do I know I'm not now dreaming? Do I know I'm not having a hallucination, etc.? There are puzzles like that, but nobody thinks, well, that shows we don't really know anything. That the growth of knowledge is quite stunning. If we could take Descartes, or better still, Locke or Hume, into a university bookstore and show them textbooks on civil engineering or cell and molecular biology, I think it would take their breath away. We just know a hell of a lot more than people knew in the 17th century. You see, in the 17th century, intellectuals like yourselves could genuinely be puzzled by the possibility of knowledge. And there were widespread falsehoods were accepted among educated people. Educated people in the 17th century believed that there were unicorns. Yeah, there are these animals. I haven't seen any lately, but there are these animals running around with one horn. And that's not true anymore. We now know too much, and there's too much spread of knowledge, and it's too well established. So I think the skeptical epistemology is no longer the center of the subject. Well, what is the center of the subject? Well, I don't think right now, if you look at it as a sociological phenomenon, there is a center of philosophy. I think what ought to be the center of philosophy is the philosophy of mind, because that's the entering wedge into solving the problems I said were central to philosophy. The problem of how do we reconcile a conception that we have of ourselves as free, mindful, rational, speech, act, performing, social, political, aesthetic, ethical human beings. How do we reconcile that conception with a world that consists entirely in mindless, meaningless physical particles? But not everybody agrees with me about that, not by any means. But in any case, that seems to me the most fascinating part of philosophy. Okay, well, I just said all that, so as you're getting ready to take a final exam, you ought to have some conception. I'm not allowed to say anything new that's going to be on the final exam. I won't ask you on the final exam, how do you refute Descartes? There won't be such a question. But that is the overall, I wanted to situate the material of this course into larger intellectual life. Okay, questions about that, or now questions about anything in the course, because this, as I said, is our last session. Yeah.
I can see how naive realism deals with certain primary properties of objects, like shape. It's easier to see that we directly perceive shape, but how does it deal with secondary properties like color?
Okay. Let me repeat the question, because it is a classic philosopher's question. Naive realism might deal with certain aspects of objects like shape, but how does it deal with the so-called secondary properties like color? Now, in order to answer that, I have to say a little bit about how naive realism was supposed to be refuted. There were two arguments against naive realism. One was the argument from science that says we know from science that we don't really see objects. What we see is the impact that objects have on our nervous system, and that is to produce an experience in the brain. And that's a view that I told you is still widely held by a lot of people in the sciences, even some of them who are pretty smart. And then the other view, which was widely held among philosophers, was that naive realism couldn't handle the problem of illusion, as it's called, or the problem of hallucinations. Yes, I think I see a piece of chalk, but suppose it's a hallucination. What do I see then? Well, what I see is the appearance of a piece of chalk. But then, if I say in that case, I don't see the piece of chalk itself, but only the appearance of the piece of chalk, shouldn't I say that in every case? Because there's no difference in the quality of the experience between seeing the piece of chalk and seeing the appearance of the piece of chalk. So a conclusion of both of these arguments was to drive the relation to the object out of perception. So you go from this picture that says the guy sees the object, this line, which represents the visual experience itself, becomes the object of the experience. So you go from this picture, which is naive realism, to this picture, which is the representative theory. Now, the people who held the representative theory, notably Locke, had faced exactly the question that you just posed. And what they said was, your ideas resemble certain aspects of the object and not others. And they made a distinction between the primary qualities and the secondary qualities. The primary qualities were things like shape, size, velocity, number, how many objects are there. And the secondary qualities were color, taste, smell, felt, texture, and sound. And then they said the object really has the primary qualities. It really does have shape and size, but it doesn't have the secondary qualities. The object doesn't really have a color, and it does not really have a smell, but those are systematic illusions produced in us by the impact of the object on our nervous system. Now, this distinction between the primary and secondary has become unfashionable, and I think most philosophers reject it. I think there's something in it, and here's why. Ask yourself, what fact makes it true that the basketball is round? And the fact that makes it true is that the surface of the basketball contains molecules, all of which are equidistant from a common center. That's what it is for it to be round. So the fact that makes it round is very much a feature of the world which corresponds to our representation when we say it's round. But what fact makes it red? I suppose it's a red basketball. What fact makes it red is not like that. The fact that makes it red, it really is red, the fact that makes it red is that it has a surface structure which enables it to reflect light waves in a way that stimulates our nervous system in a certain way. So I think there is a distinction between the primary and the secondary qualities. There are objective truths about the secondary qualities. If you're in a court case, what color was the basketball? There's a true or false answer to that. Did it smell like lemon when you put the piece of fruit to your mouth? There's a true or false answer to that. But there's an element of ontological subjectivity to the secondary qualities which you do not have in the primary qualities, because we're able to discriminate them in ways that depend on the structure of our nervous system. And there are some other indices of this. All of the primary qualities are accessible to two senses, and always the same two, sight and touch. Whereas so all the primary qualities are accessible to two senses, sight and touch, but the secondary qualities are always specific to a certain sense. So color is specific to vision, smell to smell, sound to hearing, and so on with the other two. That is, the primary qualities are accessible to two senses. The secondary qualities are accessible to only one sense. And now, and this is the third feature, the primary qualities really are necessary conditions for something being an object. You can't be a material object without a shape and a mass, whereas you can be an object if it doesn't have a smell. An object need not, in order to exist, exude a smell. So I think there is a distinction to be made between the primary and secondary qualities, and it fits in with what I was saying earlier about what we're trying to do is give a conception of how we fit in to a world consisting of physical particles, and it turns out that those physical particles have effects on our nervous systems where we can make epistemically objective claims about the object. It really is red, for example, or it really did make a sound, but where the fact that corresponds to it really is red, or it really did make a sound, are facts having to do with the relationship between the object and our nervous system in a way that's not the case with the object is round. There, the fact that makes it true that it's round doesn't depend on our nervous system. Our finding it out depends on the nervous system, but the fact that makes it round are that the distribution of molecules on the surface are all equidistant from a common center, and that's what it is for it to be round. Okay, I hope that answers the question, because it is, as I'm sure you're aware, that's a famous traditional question. However, it's not one you're likely to hear on the exam, so maybe somebody would like to have more questions about the exam. Yeah?
I was forgetting what Davidson's metaphor account was for yours.
Can you ask it again?
Davidson's metaphor account?
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, let's take Davidson on metaphor. Now, in a way, I really admire Davidson's article on metaphor because it upset the apple cart. It shook up the whole discussion. And what Davidson says is there isn't any such thing as metaphorical meaning. In a metaphor, the words mean what they always mean. This is why he says most metaphors are just false and most similes are true. If I say Sally's a block of ice, well, that's just false. She's not a block of ice. She's a human female with the usual 46 chromosomes, and she doesn't melt at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So the metaphor is just false. If I say Sally's like a block of ice, well, that's true because everything's like everything else in some respect or another. So it turns out on Davidson's account that most metaphors are false, most similes are true. But the words mean what they always mean. There isn't any such thing as metaphorical meaning. Now, Davidson is militating against a tradition that says in a metaphor, at least one of the words changes its meaning. Now, my own view is kind of halfway between. I claim that the problem of metaphor is a special case of the distinction between sentence meaning and speaker meaning. And we know there are lots of cases of that distinction. Hyperbole, understatement, as well as indirect speech acts are all cases where you get a non-identity of speaker meaning and sentence meaning, and metaphor is just one case of that. But I think there is such a thing as speaker meaning in the case of metaphor, which goes beyond sentence meaning. Davidson doesn't think that. He thinks that in the cases where that seems to be true, those would all be dead metaphors, like leg of the table or the computer mouse, where the metaphor is no longer a live metaphor. But if it is a live metaphor, if it's an actual metaphor, then there's no such thing, according to Davidson, as metaphorical meaning. There's just the literal meaning of the sentence. Well, what does metaphor do then, according to Davidson? Well, it's like Wittgenstein's famous example of seeing as. You can see it either as a duck or as a rabbit. I don't know if I get better or worse over the course of the semester drawing this famous beast, which is, as you know, either a duck looking that way or a rabbit looking up that way. It's not a bad duck rabbit. It'll be lost forever as soon as they wash the blackboard. And now, says Davidson, to say Sally's a block of ice is like the duck rabbit. You can see Sally as a block of ice. But, and this is the key point in Davidson, seeing as is not seeing that. And the idea there is you shouldn't think that there's some new propositional content conveyed by saying Sally is a block of ice. Rather, it's just an invitation to see her in a certain light. Now, I have objections to that I think are decisive. And one is you can actually have arguments about a metaphor, and somebody can claim, no, the metaphorical statement was not true. Of course, Sally's not literally a block of ice. I might have a block of ice that I keep in the fridge called Sally, but that's not the case we're imagining. We're talking about an actual human being. And if Sally's a block of ice, somebody might say to me, you just don't know Sally. And then he tells me a story that justifies his claim, Sally's a bonfire. She's not a block of ice. Now, I will leave you to fill in the sordid details of how this debate might actually play out. But I think that the decisive objection to Davidson is that if that were right, if he were right that there's no such thing as metaphorical meaning, then there couldn't be any propositional content conveyed by the metaphor. There couldn't be any propositional content which was accessible as true or false, other than the literal propositional content, which is in almost all cases false. I mean, Sally's not literally a block of ice, yes, but all the same, metaphorically, it might be the case that she's a block of ice. And then the task for a theory of metaphor is to try to analyze, well, what are the mechanisms by which the speaker, the hearer, gets from the literal speaker, the literal sentence meaning to the intended speaker meaning. So I see the problem of metaphor as a special case, as a very important special case of the distinction between the literal meaning of the sentence and the intended meaning of the speaker. Now, and as you know, there are lots of different variations on that. So indirect speech acts are quite different from metaphor, because in the case of the indirect speech act, the speaker actually does intend the literal meaning. He says, can you open the window? And he means literally, can you open the window? Or he says, you're making too much noise, and he means literally, you're making too much noise, but he means something more than that. So for me, in the case of the indirect speech act, the literal meaning, this circle, is contained within the intended speaker meaning. What's the proof of that? The proof is the response to the literal meaning is always appropriate. Somebody says, can you open the window? I might say, yes, I can. I'll do it. But I might also say, no, I can't. It's locked shut. Or that's not even a window. That's a trompe-l'oeil painting of a window on the wall of the room. Or my arm is broken. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that I can respond literally to the literal. I can respond to the literal meaning, and that suggests that the literal meaning is understood as such. But, if it's the guy who says you're making too much noise, you might say, well, it's not me making the noise, it's somebody else making the noise. Or I'm not making too much noise, you're just hypersensitive, you don't appreciate rock music, or something like that, where I respond to the literal meaning. Now, in the case of the metaphor, if I respond to the literal meaning, it's a joke, or I'm continuing the metaphor. That is, when Romeo and Juliet says, Juliet is the sun, it won't do for me to say, well, that means she's composed entirely of hot gases. And no, that's, again, an inappropriate response unless I'm trying to turn it into some kind of a joke. So on my account, the metaphor, you go from the literal meaning, you go from here, from the literal meaning, to a metaphorical meaning, which is here. And then you go through the literal meaning to the metaphor. And then in a dead metaphor, you bypass the old literal meaning, and it acquires a new literal meaning. And that's true of a lot of metaphors. So I think, for example, cold for a certain type of emotional state or a certain type of personality, that's now become a dead metaphor. And indeed, the dictionaries I've looked at list unemotional as one of the literal meanings of cold. And I think mouse is no longer a metaphor for the tool you use for your computer. It's acquired a new literal meaning. The test is this. When you hear the expression, do you go through the literal meaning? Do you think of actual mice running around when you go to the computer store to buy a new mouse? I don't. Or if you think of the leg of the table, do you actually think of human legs or animal legs? No, I don't either. Similarly with these other body metaphors, the head of the table, the foot of the table, I don't think of the literal meaning. Those have become dead metaphors for me. However, dead metaphors are interesting because in the case of the dead metaphor, the word has acquired a new literal meaning, and that suggests that the metaphor fills a semantic gap that we need. That the way that the language develops, the way the language grows, is typically by metaphorical accretions acquiring new literal meanings. And if you look at the new technology, like computer technology, it's full of metaphors that have acquired new literal meanings. The motherboard is not literally maternal, but that's now become a new technical term in computer science. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
So, dealing with that problem there, so you pointed out the fact that there's some metaphors where it seems like there is only really one thing we're meaning by it. And
Yeah.
You've allowed that.
Right.
Davidson had certain poetic metaphors where there could be,
That's right. Yeah. A whole lot of them. Yeah.
And then, so I was wondering if you could possibly motivate his claim that, especially things like poetic metaphors.
Yeah.
To the ones he gives in the essay, that he gives the statement something like a picture is not 1,000 words, it's no words. Like the metaphor is always beyond, or has more than a certain number of interpretations you
Yeah.
can give of it, or something like that. I had a little bit of trouble following.
Well, okay, I think there's another problem with Davidson. I suggested one problem, and that is that, well, if it were right, it's just seeing as, then you couldn't argue. Then you couldn't be a propositional content over which you were having a debate. But another issue that is related to that is that he says, well, any metaphor will work, or something. I forget exactly what something. Most metaphors work, and most don't. I mean, if I say Sally's a block of ice, you all understand that. And it's not a dead metaphor. They won't, you look up block of ice in a dictionary, they won't list that as one of its meanings. We look at block and ice and so on, do the compositional bit. But if I say Sally is a prime number larger than 37, but smaller than 51, I don't get it. What's meant to be conveyed by that? What is the metaphor? I could guess. I mean, we're all hyper intense mathematicians, and we care desperately about prime numbers and so on, and we're busy trying to prove gold box conjecture. Maybe for that kind of a subgroup, there would be some special metaphor conveyed by Sally's a prime number between 43 and 51, but for most of us, it conveys nothing. It doesn't say, oh, well, see Sally as a prime number. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. So there are lots of metaphors where you can invent a kind of interpretation. Sally is an itemized deduction. Well, I could sort of do something with that, but Sally's a prime number. I can't do anything with that one. So I think, again, Davidson gives you the impression that there are no constraints on what metaphors are going to work. You're just under instruction to see something as something else. But a lot of times you just can't. You can't see Sally, at least I can't see Sally as a prime number, not for any of the Sallys I know. But I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's another difficulty I have with Davidson. Davidson correctly sees what the previous authors did not see, and I also point out the same thing he does, namely, you don't get a new sentence meaning in the case of a metaphor. If it was literally a new meaning, it would stop being a metaphor. The whole point of its being a metaphor is that the expression, the sentence, contains its literal meaning. There's no new meaning attached to the metaphorical, to the sentence itself. The new meaning is entirely in the speaker, who goes through the metaphorical meaning, goes through the literal meaning to get to the metaphorical meaning. But on my account, metaphorical meaning is a special case of speaker meaning. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about the structures of speech acts and intentional states. Because at first I thought that was just the sincerity condition, but then I realized that intentional states aren't exactly equivalent with psychological states.
No, intentional states are types of psychological state. Now, not every psychological state is intentional. So, for example, pains are not intentional, because I don't have a pain that such and such is the case. Okay, but you remember in the very first part of the course when we talked about speech acts, I said that the speech act has this structure. You present a propositional content with a certain illocutionary force, and the intentional state has this structure. A propositional content occurs in a certain psychological mode, a certain psychological state. The similarities are that they both have conditions of satisfaction and direction of fit, but the key difference is that the speech act is an act and the intentional state is not an act, it's a state. This is an intentional act. Okay, but now with those two similarities, the propositional content, the condition of three similarities: propositional content, direction of fit, condition of satisfaction. The fact that the one is an act and the other is not an act has enormous consequences because this involves meaning. You have to utter something with a certain meaning, but now whenever you do that, whenever you present a propositional content that has a certain meaning with a certain illocutionary force, then you are necessarily expressing an intentional state. So every speech act, with oddball exceptions, and I'm not even convinced they are exceptions, has a sincerity condition. And the sincerity condition is the condition that there be a certain intentional state that you express. When you make an assertion, you express a belief. When you make an order, you express a desire. When you make a promise, you express an intention, and so on through all the cases. Now, when I wrote the stuff that you read, or at least the early stuff, I didn't think declarations had a sincerity condition. I didn't see how you could declare war insincerely. But now I think they do. I think, yes, when you declare war, you do intend, you do believe that your utterance is making it the case that there's a state of war, and you do express a desire to introduce a state of war. Is that we neglect these because declarations, the last thing we care about is the sincerity of the speaker. What we want to know is, does it succeed? Did you really create a new government or create a state of warfare? So you do get, I thought that in the case of declarations you didn't have these, but I now think you do. Because you committed yourself to believing that your utterance will create a state of war and to desiring that your utterance create a state of war. So I think every speech act that has this structure is necessarily an expression of a sincerity condition. In the case of declarations, two sincerity conditions that have that structure. So there are a complex set of relations between intentional states and speech acts, but they are, in a way, rather simple and beautiful. Every one of these is an expression of one of those, but inherits from this propositional content, direction of fit, and conditions of satisfaction. And now you get an interesting puzzle, and that is, well, what is meant by saying it is a sincerity condition if you can perform the speech act even when you're insincere? You can make a promise even if you don't intend to keep it. You can give an order even if you don't want the hearer to obey it. And you can make a statement even if you don't believe it. Now, I put that by saying, all the same, when you made the statement, you did express a belief. If you say it's raining and you're lying, you know that it's not raining. All the same, you did express the belief that it's raining, and that's all I need, is the fact that you are representing yourself as believing that. Now, some people have objected to that. They say, well, you can't express a belief you don't have. Well, I'm not worried about the word express. I think you can express a belief you don't have. But if they think, well, no, express means pushing out something that's already there, and you can't press out a belief unless it's already there, okay, get a different verb. I wanted the idea that when you make a statement, you're committing yourself not only to a truth about how the world is, but to a belief about how the world is. And the simplest proof of that is Moore's paradox. Moore says, the hypothesis that it's raining is independent of the hypothesis that I believe that it's raining. But if that were so, if there's just a total independence, I ought to be able to say, I believe that it's raining, that's about me, and it's not raining, that's about the weather. But you can't do that. That's inconsistent, even though it's not logically contradictory, because it's logically possible both that it's raining and that I believe that it's not raining. You can't say those, even though they're logically consistent. And Moore was puzzled by that, and I'm answering the puzzle. The answer to the puzzle is, whenever you make a statement, you express a belief with exactly that same propositional content and conditions of satisfaction. And Moore's paradox is the proof of that, and now I want to suggest the evidence that my account of this is the right way to think of it. It generalizes across the board. You can't say it's raining, but I don't believe it's raining. But for the same reason, you can't say, I order you to leave the room, but I don't want you to leave the room. I promise to come and see you, but I don't intend to come and see you. I apologize for stepping on your face, but I'm not one damn bit sorry that I stepped on your face. Congratulations on winning the Nobel Prize, but I'm damn pissed off that you won the Nobel Prize, and so on. You can't do all of those, and all for the same reason. Yes, you're right. The hypothesis that I order you to leave the room is different from the hypothesis that I want you to leave the room. All the same, when you issue the order, you express the want. And that goes through every intentional state that has a propositional content. In every case, there's a sincerity condition, and you can't perform the speech act and deny the presence of the sincerity condition. Oh my gosh, I discover the semester is just now over. Anyway, good luck on the final exam and have a good